You mentioned about job hunting and being a CS grad, not getting lost in the pile of resumes. How did you manage that to get your first internship, your first job?
Again, quick background on me. So, came into college as a computer science major. That was pretty much, I knew I was going to do that. I had taken computer science classes throughout high school, taken AP Comp Sci, the works. I was ready to, skip a college class because of the AP credits I had gotten. Um, but once I started working, I guess I'll first start with how I got my first internship. Almost felt like a complete accident in a way. I had attended this conference called Grace Hopper, which is this women in tech conference. My college actually supported people going, and I'd applied. I didn't even get in through my college, right? I was on the e board, and they still didn't select me because I was just very young. I was a sophomore at the time, and the priority would go to people that need a
Hmm.
full time job, which totally makes sense. But I had happened to apply to a couple other scholarship programs, and I remember getting the email of me having gotten in, and I was like, I think things are going to change. My life is honestly going to change from this. And that year it was in person, it was in Florida. Incredible energy. I then COVID and all of that started to happen. So I feel like
Yeah.
that energy of the in person conference, I basically didn't get to feel again. But that was so pivotal for me because I've never felt more re inspired. Like my sophomore year of college, I was already starting to be like, classes are kind of hard. What am I doing? Like, I went to a primarily male dominated school too. Like, I was often just the only girl in my classes. I was like, I don't know what's going on. But going to that conference was so pivotal for me, where I met so many people that were excited, interested, passionate about computer science, technology. I ended up interviewing with a bunch of different companies there. I came in also with no interviews, which was
Hmm.
also like, I literally didn't know what I was doing, right? I was sophomore in college. But then ultimately I ended up getting a software role at Bank of America. The next year I attended virtually, also got a software engineering role at JP Morgan. And that was the time that I started to understand a bit more about what it actually meant to be a software engineer and think about things outside of that. But the attending conference was definitely one of the biggest things and one of the biggest unlocks for myself when it came to understanding what the path that I wanted to go down ended up being.
I saw something very, very unique in your resume, which is you said student government undefeated for 7 years. I mean, the way you weave that narrative in really reflects on your thinking about the reader. I've seen a lot of resumes myself where people just say, okay, we were in student government for 7 years, but saying undefeated, using words that are, of accomplishment or providing a benefit to someone. That's very rare to see in a resume. How do you weave these narratives in?
Yeah, I mean they come from reflection and honestly now with all these AI tools, like you can get GPT to be the hype person for you, right? Just put in your experience and be like, how do you make this sound the most impactful, most exciting, most powerful? Like use verbs from this guide, like whatnot. There's so many ways to not necessarily put as much upfront work as you might have had to initially. I actually didn't even realize I still have that on my resume somewhere. I do think again the more you have, especially on a LinkedIn profile, for example, where maybe you're not limited to just one page, the more potential there is for a connection. Because that's ultimately one of the biggest things when it comes to recruiting and just
Yeah.
networking in general is that you want to find some point in common. A lot of PMs have done student government. A lot of PMs have done some of the clubs, tutoring, all these different activities. A lot of PMs came from computer science degrees. So the more that you share about your background, your interests, the different things you're interested in and participate in, the more likely you are to have that degree of connection. And then you have a worthwhile person to come to for advice and maybe a new job. There's so many positive outcomes that happen when you share a bit more.
And your personal brand, how has that helped you get a opportunity or a job interview?
Yeah, let's see. So job interviews and networking is definitely one of the biggest outcomes I think of having a very public personal brand.
Hmm.
I think the nice thing about trying to put as much as you can online is that you actually, in a sense, remove some of the upfront work that you might have to do where people end up reaching out to you. right? You don't necessarily need to be the one trying to go find people that relate to you and all of these things. Like when you are very searchable, when you're very like SEO friendly in a sense,
Yeah.
it makes it a lot easier for the right people to come to you. So I feel like that's an advantage that I've had where I've had people that I just find cool and interesting and exciting, like working at interesting companies or starting their own companies, whatever it might be, actually reach out to me. And that's nice because, again, I'm just trying to publicly be myself as much as possible. But now people are getting invested and interested in what I'm doing. And they're also very unique characters that I would want to get to know. So I think in a way, even just from like a connection friendship standpoint, let's say, like the more you share, the more likely you are to like attract the people that you're also want to be in groups with.
Um, Something about you, like you have a personality, you have certain experience, you have certain knowledge. How does that, instantly make it a hit with hiring managers or colleagues? What would people say about you when you're not in the room?
I like, yeah, it's a good question. I was reviewing my reviews to see what do people actually say about me. But I think this goes back to the energy one, where it's she gets into an ambiguous space and is able to just drive clarity, drive ownership,
Hmm.
and do that all with like positive energy rather than it seeming like this is such a daunting, like her difficult task to do. So I definitely think that's something I've always brought into like calls when it came to interviews. Two parts of that. One, I would say definitely do your research when you're about to interview with a company. You should know the latest and greatest of what's going on. I think that's one of the easiest and almost like the least you should do when you're entering a situation like that. It's pretty surprising how many people might not know of like the products that are ongoing or whatnot when they're interviewing for a company. But the second element there is that you shouldn't necessarily feel like you're putting on a fake face either, because as much as, especially if you're coming from a place of not having a job and the potential unemployment element, that can be stressful, but I do think it is a match, right, where if I didn't get an offer but I also like didn't like the interviewer and I feel like we didn't hit it off, or the hiring manager, whatnot, you wouldn't necessarily want to work there either, right? And I think that's something that people don't necessarily think about as much when you're in those high stress situations, which again is totally fair. But just remember that as much as you're trying to find a company and kind of woo them and wow them into an offer, you should also be thinking about like, hey, do I want to work and
Work
dedicate
there. Yeah.
most of my life, day to day to this company as well. So I think it's finding that mix of how can I truly showcase who I am in a call, in a 30-minute interview call with someone, but also try to understand, okay, what is it actually like to work there? Is this someone that I'm going to be working with, from 9 to 5, 8 to 5 every day for the next 5 days, a week? So thinking about things like that, I think is also important when it comes to those interviews.
So you started building your brand early. I mean, maybe you realized it, maybe you did not. Tutoring, coding, student government, fellowships. What would you recommend some recent graduate who might not have or might feel like they don't have this kind of background or haven't done some of this stuff?
I would say I mean, there are a couple of things I would recommend. I think first, assuming you have at least a somewhat built out LinkedIn, like let's say you have even like 200 connections. I would start out with just posting about what's going on, right? If you're a computer science student, maybe talk about a project you worked on, maybe talk about the news that's going on. If you're into, some of the AI ethics side of things or consumer space, whatever it might be, just start posting about the things you're actually interested in. Because
Hmm.
again, coming to something we talked about earlier, the right people get attracted to you, right? This is how also news feeds work. This is how like these algorithms work. People that relate to you and maybe have something to say about the things you're sharing will see your post, will interact with your post. And it might feel a little cringy to start in a sense that, maybe you don't normally do that. You want to be seen like that. But ultimately, that is a core part of growing your career, and anyone that has anything worthwhile won't see posting as cringy. And I think that was a big shift for me too, because I used to be a little shy to post things online. I was like, oh, what will people think? Especially if you don't have a following, that's even more intimidating. But ultimately, I remember someone saying this more about like a video creator or a musician, like no one's going to think a musician, some super successful musician, isn't going to think it was cringy for you to post a song once, right? Because they've been there and now they're hyper successful. So no one thinks of it as like awkward and weird. But again, the people that you want to be compared to, or, everyone started somewhere. So don't take yourself out of the race too early by just thinking and being afraid of being perceived.
So the idea that you want to get over your imposter syndrome and start doing something, what would you recommend a recent graduate to start doing this week to get off the imposter syndrome and start coming up with ideas that they can share?
If I'm thinking of a persona of someone that is a college student, maybe pursuing,
Yeah.
again, since we've kind of kept on this theme, like computer science, but interested in product management, besides maybe just posting online, I would think about just growing your network, like day to day of, okay, like reading interesting articles, maybe posting about those, but then also seeing other people that might inspire you in this space if you are still feeling a bit of imposter syndrome of, okay, I don't have anything worthwhile to share
Yeah.
just yet. Like connect with people that maybe went to the same university as you. And now as you grow that network, now you're also seeing the posts that they might make a bit more, and getting a deeper following. But I'd also like lean on AI a lot more too, of just like, hey, like this is how I'm feeling. These are some of the things that interest me. You're sharing this with AI, like no one else needs to see this, right? You could say, I'm interested in computer science, but I also love to paint. Like you can give it a full view of you and then talk through what your best next steps should be based on what your why is, where you want to see yourself, what you're trying to do. Like, are you trying to become a startup founder? Are you trying to completely change career paths and you don't even want to work in tech? Are you trying to switch into product? Are you trying to become a product engineer? Like there's so many different flavors of it. And I do think that leaning on some AI tools to also workshop it with you is a great strategy when, again, maybe you have imposter syndrome and don't want to share it with real people just yet. So as you're trying to come up with ideas, we definitely recommend leaning on AI as well.
Your I saw you have a teaching career, which kind of connects very well with content creation, which connects very well with potentially thought leadership. And you've really done a great job of weaving all of these together. How would you ask like a recent graduate to think about transferable skills that they might typically overlook?
It's funny looking back at all the different things I participated in because I think at the time I didn't even realize that they are so interconnected and have so many
Yeah.
interchangeable skills and are skills that I ended up using as a PM day to day. So I think it just starts with really trying as much as possible, is the cliche saying, but really just try to do a bit of everything. And then once you find one club or one interest that you're into, start to go to that activity. If it is a part of what you want to do, try to excel at it, try to become a part of the leadership board in that. But also see what those people at that activity are doing outside of that too. Because I thought this was funny, even reflecting on some of how I met my college friends.
Mhm.
It all started with us actually being in the same clubs. And the reason that that's such a key element to fostering relationships is because you, again, immediately have common ground. But then seeing what they do outside of just that club and being inspired through that, I think you start to realize a bit more of what the transferable skills might be. But I do think that it can be maybe a little intimidating to think about things just as like, okay, what is the long term value for me and how's it going to add up into everything else? And that's where I think just like truly what draws you and excites you comes to play a bit more too. And the best way to realize that is just trying to do a bit of everything. And I guess last thing on that note too is sometimes there's a difference between who we want to be and what we actually are.
Yeah.
So I would definitely challenge people to try and actually do the thing of like who they want to be. Because for me growing up, we talked about student government a bunch. I did that literally from middle school, like sixth grade, up until and through college. Like that was something that I did for the longest time. And I received lots of different speaking engagements. I spoke at my high school graduation. I spoke at accepted students day at my college. But believe it or not, this was even throughout middle school. I was really shy. Like I was super shy. I had so many experiences of like getting up on stage, literally forgetting everything I was going to say, like having all the embarrassing moments you can imagine. But I wanted to be a good speaker. Like I kind of just again fought the imposter syndrome and was like fake it till you make it sort of energy. And then I sort of forced myself to suddenly become this better speaker. I think I was always extroverted. I wasn't changing like that, but it was something I was super intimidated by. I remember like literally like having to raise my hand and say something was like the worst moment ever. But it was something that I was interested in actually getting better at. And that was, again, a great example of something that people relate so heavily to my persona now. But it's funny because growing up, it was like, oh my gosh, the worst thing I could have imagined.